Welcome back all from your networking break. I hope you had a rich and enriching little break there. Just a reminder that at the very start of today, we have that little exercise I invited you to take part in, where you write down anything that might be getting in your way, screw it up and throw it over your shoulder, either physically or mentally. If you've found that through the course of the day, things have come up, perhaps during the lunch break, in the networking breaks, and you're finding you're a little bit distracted, then you might want to just mentally do that now. Do that little activity. It's quite a kind of Buddhist thing to do, isn't it? To just mentally screw something up, throw it away for the moment. Feel free to go and collect it later if you wish to. So in today's Public Sector and Civil Service Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Summit 2021, our theme is towards a fairer working world. And the session we're now about to do is a real treat. It's in conversation with Colonel Lucy Giles. And what we're going to be discussing is why creating an inclusive culture is a business imperative. So we've got Colonel Lucy Giles here from the British Army. Lucy was commissioned in 1992 after studying at Exeter University, and she served in what was then the newly formed Royal Logistic Corps, including postings in Germany, UK and South Africa, with deployments to Bosnia in the 1990s, East Timor and Sierra Leone. She gained her master's and completed the Advanced Command and Staff course in 2003, and then commanded 47 Air Dispatch Squadron on operations in Iraq, Afghanistan and other parts of the world. Of interest to us today, she was appointed as an instructor at the Joint Services Command and Staff College in 2011, which then led on to an appointment as commander of New College, Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst in January 2015. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I'm going to throw some stats at you about Sandhurst, and we'll see whether Lucy agrees with them or not. She won the Inspirational and Woman of the Year awards at the inaugural Women in Defence event in 2016 and has received an honorary doctorate from Exeter University. She was promoted to Colonel in 2018 and is the 36th President of the Army Officer Selection Board in Westbury, and holds a number of appointments outside the Army, notable of which to me and of great interest are that she enjoys singing and what she calls a bit of drama. I don't know whether that means drama in or outside of the workplace. And also I'm a bit conflicted. I don't know what to call you, because as a former cavalry officer myself, I feel like I should call you ma'am, because I was a rank or two below you, so I'd have to show some deference there, but I guess if you're okay with it, I was going to call you Lucy.
That's completely fine for me, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to be here, and for your very kind words to start this session. Thank you.
It's lovely to have you here, and you're very welcome. The comment I was going to make about Sandhurst is, of course, we had this this debate within ourselves offline prior to this around are you the first female commander of Sandhurst in 300 years or in 200 years? And I think we worked out that the Royal Military College, if I've got this right, was founded in 1741. And the Royal Military Academy was founded in 1741. The Royal Military College was founded in 1801. So technically it's 200 years, isn't it? And I think you said you've commissioned somewhere around 2,000 people. Is that right?
Yeah, a great privilege to be part of that. And, you know, the 2,000 people, I think, over the 3.5 years that I was there, which was great. And what is interesting is being at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst at the time I was that we introduced a lot of changes which are very relevant, I think, to the kind of conversations we are having today as part of this session. Because it's the main reason I was nominated in the Women in Defence Awards is because of the progress we'd made at Sandhurst in redesigning the course and making it inclusive. So when I came through Sandhurst, I was in an all-female company. I was the last one of the kind. And then when we, just after I'd left and got commissioned, they had a female platoon, but they were all amalgamated or linked in with male companies. And you were always, you know, in the company that had the female platoon. So inadvertently, we were creating a bit of misogyny. I was literally just having that conversation with one of my colleagues today, and I'm so pleased that we got out of that mindset, because culture, I think, is definitely set from the top, and that's the direction is set, but it has to be grown, and that includes bottom up. And what we're doing at Sandhurst now is we've got a very mixed and diverse platoon network, 18 to 28 different faiths, international cadets, UK cadets, male and female, and no judgment on background or race and so on. And what that means is it makes it more challenging in terms of leadership, and that's precisely the point. So diversity has is fantastic, and we're going to be talking about that, and it's linked to business imperative perhaps, and culture specifically. But I think that the whole point really is that if you've got that diversity, you've also got a leadership challenge, because it makes it more, you're not leading people who look like you all the time.
And the evidence, certainly from the private sector, the evidence has been that diverse teams perform better, but when they're well led, and that leading diverse teams is more challenging. So as long as you've got better leaders, you get a better outcome. In fact, earlier in today's discussions, we mentioned the fact that diverse teams that are not inclusive actually perform worse than teams that are not diverse.
Absolutely.
So we thought, didn't we, Lucy, that today we would, there's a couple of sort of areas of discussion that we wanted to unpack around this question of what's why it's a business imperative to create this inclusive culture, including things like, why fostering an inclusive culture is a business imperative, and how this can be turned into an opportunity. And I know you've got a couple of examples you could share around in the military context, how actually certainly having more inclusion of women, for example, can yield real measurable opportunities there. How inclusion creates better businesses, and the direct link to healthy people and healthy minds. And I know certainly, if I look back at my military experience, there was a lot of emphasis on healthy bodies, certainly. A lot of physical training, obviously physical fitness, and then how to create good practices that embrace and adapt to change. And I guess, you've got the benefit of about 3 decades now, haven't you, of military experience behind you, to see the sorts of changes that have happened within the military, but equally the world has changed a lot, hasn't it? And the wars that we're fighting now, and the readiness and preparation you need to have for deployment now are quite different from what they were when you started. So part one of what I thought we would explore is exploring inclusive culture. And maybe to kick us off with that, you could make some observations around the kind of what leadership looks like within the military, and the kind of training that you alluded to there. And, how is that different from, and what are you actually called to do? Why does the military exist? What's your job? What's your business? Because it's quite a sobering business, isn't it?
Yeah, because when you're talking about a business imperative, you need to try, that means different things to different people. And it's worth, the context in which I'm working is being able to achieve operational effect, which is quite broad. And it depends on the context in which you're working. So we're expeditionary in nature. So we go to different countries to create safe and secure environments, or to prosecute an armed part of the arsenal that may be used in terms of stability and a particular strategy that may be being employed by our government. So we're an arm of government to be able to deliver that. But ultimately, we are commissioned to serve Her Majesty the Queen, and the worst case scenario is prosecuting violence on the Queen's enemies. So we have a very different remit that is difficult to translate to other sectors. Other uniformed services do understand that. If you're working with the police force, they are probably more frontline than we are. They have to deal with challenges every single day. Firefighting would be similar. But if you focus in defence, and I'm talking broad defence, with just the armed element of it, I think we miss the point of the collective need across the defence enterprise, including the civil service, on which I'm conscious of this as the audience. we miss the point of what we are collectively about. But it is different. We're not about making money, which perhaps might be something that another sector might be interested in. We're not about delivering exam results, which the educational sector might be interested in. We're not about winning gold medals, which the sports sector might be interested in. So depending on how you define your business imperative depends upon how you may approach it and what therefore becomes more important to you.
And you had an interesting phrase you used, an expression to describe what it's like, what the culture and mindset is of the army, didn't you?
Yeah. So, I mean, one way of describing our approach really is I'm not in the army, I am the army. So people aren't just in it as a job, they are the job, if that makes sense. So we don't work without understanding our people really well in order to harness that talent to deliver our outputs that we're required to deliver.
And I mean, that puts into sharp relief the idea of an inclusive culture, doesn't it? Because if you don't have an inclusive culture, then that proposition fails, doesn't it? You can't say I am the army, because your experience of that is going to be you don't belong, you're not included, therefore you're not part of us.
Absolutely, and it's not a coincidence that was one of the 2 years ago, I think that was one of our strap lines in recruiting. It's that sense of belonging.
And we'll talk a bit later, perhaps more, we'll go into when we talk about things like practical steps, we might talk a bit about the training that's undertaken, because you mentioned that already, and some of the ways that perhaps the military approaches that training, what shared experiences happen there. But maybe we talk a little bit now about the other area of discussion, which is around why is this a business imperative? And I know you mentioned, well, the army is not there to make money, but you could argue, and for those who are civil servants and have any role in administering defence, you might look at how the military can avoid spending too much money. So you won't be making it, but you could save money. And presumably there is pressure on military chiefs to keep an eye on budget. And on the other hand, though, you mentioned that, you've got to be able to make decisions on the battlefield, don't you? So how does that play out in this culture of inclusion, where your business imperative is balanced between Whitehall and the battlefield?
Again, that's a big question. One of the principles of war is economy of effort, and when we practice and rehearse our planning and do our estimates at our various staff colleges, and there'll be civil servants who've done that because we work alongside them on these courses, then we always know you're never going to have enough resources to deliver what you want. Therefore, you have to prioritize, you have to come up with other mechanisms like concurrent activity, anticipation at all levels. So you've got all of these little buzzwords and toolboxes that you can draw upon, because we all never have enough of a particular thing to deliver what we need. And it's the same whether you're on operations or whether you're in barracks. I think we're more comfortable operating within a very clear military mandate and sense of purpose. It's what we train to deliver against under austere conditions, difficult environments, and ultimately being able to prosecute violence if we have to, and targeting. But the converse is that defence is still a business, and the army is still a top level or a high level budget holder, and we have to be accountable for public money and how it's spent.
It's a bit different from the old days, isn't it? When buccaneers and pirates, in some ways, the armed precursors of armies and things were actually out there making money, weren't they? Because they were basically raiding, bringing back the bounty. I mean, one of the purposes of armies back in medieval times was to win wars so that you could fill the king's treasury. We're a long way from that now, aren't we? It's the other way around. The army is a cost, and it's not, it's not designed. And what's that saying? Is it guns or butter? Is the sort of what do you want? Do you want more military equipment, or do you want to be able to feed yourselves and your people? And I guess that pressure of it actually prompted me, what you were describing there, Lucy, was prompted me to ask you a question, which is, given your business imperative, does an inclusive culture then mean that you need to include civil servants? Because you've got to interact with them.
But they are part of the team.
Yeah.
So there is much, if they're in I work alongside civil servants. I've got 9 civil servants I work with here today in the Army Officer Selection Board, and they're awesome. And they do a diversity of roles within here to keep things going. So they're as much part of the team to deliver my outputs as a military person is, or a reservist, a regular or a reservist, I should say, within the role. So really important. And actually our contracted support as well, which we rely heavily upon, both in barracks and operationally. So that's why being cognizant of your broad team and knowing them well is an important part of your role as the leader in any organisation. So it's not just about, as I said, looking like yourself and just only targeting your communication strategy just to the military elements, because they're the only ones that count. I mean, we are a long way away from that style of doing business, which maybe, I've seen in the past.
And, those structural divisions play out in the wider public sector and the private sector. I worked at Ofwat's, the water regulator, for a period. So I've had a taste of the public sector, and although we were arm's length regulator from the government, but we made use of contractors, and there is always, and then I've experienced in the private sector, again, we work with contractors in a variety of roles, and there's always that sort of concern that you've got the core team who really belong because they're permanent employees, then you've got the contractors or the others who are somehow different, and you end up with a sort of 2-tier system. And I never think that's been helpful. It's not particularly healthy, and it doesn't lead to the best outcomes. And
it definitely doesn't.
It kind of creates a division that then creates what I, in economic terms is called transaction costs between those people. But it also creates a culture, doesn't it? That's sort of a 2-tier thing.
Yeah, I mean, at the core of certainly what I recognise that we do in the Army is at the centre of it, as I mentioned previously, is people. It doesn't matter what that looks like, but it's people at the heart of it. And so we rely very much on the interactions that we have with each other. And sometimes we get that right, and sometimes we get it wrong because we've misunderstood the language we're using, or what I mean is, and I had this, at the weekend I went to a bilateral conference between Italy and the UK, which was fascinating. And I was listening to what people were describing as SMEs, and we need more SMEs. And I thought, why do you need subject matter experts? And it wasn't. It was small, medium enterprises. It meant something completely different from the, from the people that were talking about it. And it only dawned on me a little bit into the conversation. So language is everything. And there's a great book called Leadership is Language, by the same author who did Turn the Ship Around, actually, David, his name escapes me, it'll come to me, that's worth looking at, because it's not just what you say, it's also how you say it, and whether you mean it, and whether you actually are trusted to behave in the way that you say that you are going to as well.
And would it be fair to say then, David Marquet,
that's it. Thank you so much. It's on the bookshelf.
Would it be fair to say then that, really in your role, the military is always going to really face constraints, right? There's never going to be as much money as you would like, ideally, to buy equipment, resources, and so on. But what you do have available for you, like you said, is your people. And so focusing on the performance of your people can be something that you can control. And that makes it, perhaps why training and the focus on people is so important in the military. Does that then lead on to a bit of a, I don't know, an assumption around what you can do to maximize what you get from your people? If that's, how can you exploit your human resources to the best degree? And what role does an inclusive culture play in that? Does that enable you to do that better?
Well, If I relate it to my experiences, I've been in training and education of the officer corps. Unashamedly, I'm very narrow in that particular area, and I've been doing that for the last 10 years. And certainly, my experience, and this is not rocket science. And you know, I've been asked to sort of throw in a challenge to the audience, and I put this out to you up front. You know, what is it you're going to do to make a difference to your organisation, however small it may be? Because the kind word here and there, the thank you very much for doing that, the appreciation of extra effort when it's been put in, the recognition that somebody's struggling on the end of a Zoom call because they're trying to deal with kids and, you know, and it's a bit too difficult, rather than immediately judging people. Those small things, which are human interactions, forget the uniform, it's just people being normal with each other, you know, that can have a massive dividend in terms of output, because people will work for you or work with you to go that extra mile because they trust you, they believe in you. And frankly, they like you a little bit. You don't have to be liked as a leader, but it does help, I think. And I know that it might not seem very military to talk about being kind to people, but I'm telling you, I think it can pay a huge amount in the longer run. And it's sometimes known in writings as the social dividend, because it's people giving that extra, and it mitigates against that work to rule mindset, which doesn't necessarily help people, and the I've got to be at my desk to be seen at my desk culture.
And so, it's the power of thank you, isn't it? It's
a little bit of that, and but it's having a little bit more emotional intelligence than we perhaps have had in the past. We, particularly in the military, put a lot of emphasis on physicality, the PQ, the physical quotient, you know, because it's easy and it's a fairly lazy shortcut judgment on somebody's ability to lead, I think. But I'm afraid we've been doing that in the past. You know, if you've looked the part and you're winning the races, that clearly means you're a good leader, doesn't it? So there's been a lot of emphasis on that, combined with a high IQ. And we definitely need intellect, and I can talk if you need to, if you would like, if it's helpful, about what we're looking at in terms of selection for future leaders and potential for training. But we do need bright people. But if you have that high IQ, it can, and you are biased towards that at the cost of EQ, I don't think you're going to get a balanced leader. And I think the edge is now in the EQ space, because you can surround yourself as a leader, because you can surround yourself with the right people who've got the high IQ to deal with, you know, difficult problems and wicked problems that are out there, to use Grint's, you know, phraseology. But so I think the premium is in the EQ space, not necessarily, because PQ you can train and you can deal with. IQ, there's an element of basic ability, but you can build on it, or you can bring the resources in to your organization. But EQ, if you're leading, I think is going to be a premium into the future.
I'm conscious too that, you know, as you've said earlier, prosecuting violence is only really one aspect of what you do, and that's, you know, reasonably restricted in terms of the totality of what you do. So yes, you need to have that ability to do it when the time comes, but I guess, and there's still a certain amount of physicality required, isn't there? But we have a lot of weapon systems now that are, you know, obviously if something's mechanized, if it's vehicle based, if it's technology based, raw grunt power like it was 200 or 300 years ago, when, you know, the best technology you had was a horse. Other than that, you're on foot, and maybe that's less important now. But there are all those other things that go on out there outside of the battlefield, for which the range of skills that leaders need isn't all based around your physique and your stamina. And I know you've certainly committed some of your intelligence and used your EQ, and some of that's been committed to paper, because I know you mentioned you'd written a paper on why there need to be more women in the army and why that's important. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I've been we have gender champions, and it's the same in the civil service, and you have ethnic and minority champions, and you've got various champions in there. And I did hold our gender champion to account, and I said, well, what does that actually mean, and what are you doing, and blah blah. And I thought it would be helpful to, particularly for a gender champion, to understand from the minority. I'm specifically focusing on women. I know there's gender is a spectrum, but for me, I was looking specifically at females in the army, women in the army, and the case for why why I realise is it's no good just saying we need more women. You've got to make the case to say why that's helpful. And so, and a classic example, and it was used in Northern Ireland back in the day, and we had what was called green finches. These are female search officers that would, because they were the only ones who could search the women there, because the men, it was inappropriate for them to do it. And so this is nothing new, but it's putting it a little bit more out there, especially as now all roles are open to women and men across the armed forces, let alone the army. And so if we've got a friend of mine, Tom Robinson, he's commanding the battle group over in Mali at the moment, and was just handed over. So what is why would you have a predominantly male battle group deploying to a Muslim country where you won't be able to access half the population and gather the intelligence, because you're not culturally, with the little c, you're not able to integrate with that part of the population. So, and it was brought again to me, if that's a deployment, if you look at in barracks, and if you look at business that we have routinely through our regional points of contact, a colleague of mine was commanding a Gurkha regiment, and one of her team unfortunately became very, very ill and unfortunately passed away. And she was invited she wanted to go to the service, which she would normally not be allowed to go into because she's female. But what she was able to do is go and see the women who were mourning. And it was a completely, it changed the dynamic in that part of the country in terms of recognizing that the army has a different side of it, because the women were more engaged, if that makes sense. When you're dealing with, well, hang on, I'll rephrase that. I found it helpful if you can make the case more practically as to why you need more women. And some of you may have picked up our diversity targets, and specifically looking at gender, was about 15% in the next 10 years or so. You may have picked up that the Women in Defence Charter, which is slightly different from Women in Defence governing body and the prizes and everything, but the charter, which people sign up to just say that they are engaged with it across the defence enterprise, have advocated for 30% by 2030, and rightly so. So we can get a critical mass of thinking and influence in a particular current minority within the army.
So you've already, I think, opened the horizons of some people's perspectives around, kind of what the army does, what the military does, and how if we take too narrow a focus on that, we can think, oh, well, we've got to have lots of strong, young, physically fit men to fight because, it's all about war and battle. But actually, that's the exception to the rule. Most of the time is spent probably on soft operations, on huts and mines, on other deployment, on logistics, on dealing with the running of the army day-to-day, on training, all of these other things where you can deploy what you're referring to there in terms of EQ and IQ as well as the PQ. I think you made an allusion there to also the trans aspect of inclusion there, and I think that's a really interesting development. I mean, when I came over and watched the military forces marching in the Pride Parade in London in uniform, and I think I was there for the transition where they originally could march but in civilian clothes only, and then they were allowed to march in uniform, and I thought what an amazing signal that sent, and it really felt like the military had grown up. It was acting in an adult way. But of course, there's been other issues around trans inclusion in the military. We know there was a period there in the US not that long ago when there were executive orders banning trans people from serving. And I was struck by the fact that in the UK, I think it was the Second Sea Lord issued a very strong statement saying we're proud of our trans people who serve in the military, and we honour them and respect them. And that sent a really clear signal. So, it's for me, it's a mark of the maturity of an organisation to be able to say, we can function fully being inclusive, and it doesn't mean we're weak, and it doesn't mean we're giving in or abandoning standards.
No, absolutely. It doesn't, as I said, it's looking at the operational outputs that you're required to do. And I had a meeting this morning, and it was all about physical entry standards. We're adjusting what we do here to make it completely gender free, rather than we've got one aspect of what we do, which is gender fair. It's done for very good reason back in the day. I don't think it stands up for scrutiny now, and it will change. So we can adapt, and we can make it, focused on has somebody got the right ingredients that we need to do the particular job that we're asking them to do. In the officer corps, it's fairly generic. And then we hone that into through arms and selection boards. In the soldier space, they are looked at for their armour service in the assessment space. So they have to meet a certain standard to be able to go to a certain corps, and then they do their training. So it's fit for role. Yeah, so I will pick you up on one thing, David, if I may, because you did mention about, that I highlighted, not only that there may be young, fit young men to be able to do all the sort of perceived, frontline roles and dash down crawling and everything else. I would offer that the whole point is that that's open to everybody, and that the softer areas, as was described, maybe logistics administration, which of course there isn't really a frontline anymore, and we were all as much in a threat box as anyone when we were deployed. That's equally for everybody as well.
Absolutely, point taken. Although what I was referring to was kind of the stereotype of the past, which is that,
brilliant.
Yeah, which is that the military's there to go off and fight war, and we need fit young men to do that. And certainly back in my day, line units were only male. I mean, I served in an armoured regiment, and women were the cooks and the clerks.
Yeah, I know. And we even, do you know what? In the Women's Royal Army Corps, there was even an advert, which I think was quite good. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it does the rounds occasionally, and it's got women can do the dishes, and then have them actually putting a signals dish up, and women can do cooking, and it had somebody doing bomb disposal or something like that. It was just taking the mickey a little bit about some of the stereotypes. Yeah.
And our discussion point at the moment is around kind of why it's a business imperative, but we are naturally drifting towards the third area, which is what are the practical steps for creating this inclusive culture and realizing this imperative. But before we leave the why it's an imperative part, because you've mentioned there, okay, well, one reason why it's imperative to have an inclusive culture where you have women deployed and valued is because in certain theatres they confer an advantage you wouldn't otherwise have. Intelligence gathering in a Muslim country being one example, or as you said, searching in Northern Ireland. I've got an example of from my own dim, dark past where I learned the value of not making assumptions about people and not giving in to stereotypes. And it concerned one of my troopers. I was in a reconnaissance troop. It's very important to be able to observe things. If you're in a reconnaissance troop, that's effectively what your job is. It's to be able to go out and look on the battlefield and see things. So as part of our training, we played a game called Kim's Game, which many people on the summit here might have heard of, where you lay a number of objects down on the ground, you cover them with a blanket, you take the blanket off and you give people 10 seconds to memorize as many as they can. So in my troop, I had a trooper who, his nickname was Trooper Gannet. Gannet's a seabird that eats a lot, and he used to eat a lot, but never put weight on. He was as thin as anything, but ate and ate and ate. And that, along with some other characteristics and his personality, made him very excluded from the main culture of the troop. He was seen as an outsider. He was seen as a bit of a a strange entity. He was very low in standing. You know, his status within the troop was right at the bottom, and no one thought he was any good for anything. Anyway, we played this game, and I don't know, the average of if you put 30 objects out, people might remember about 10 of them or something, maybe 8, maybe 12. He was off the charts. I think he memorized something like 24 of these objects and was able to look at them and see them and memorize. Now, that's an incredibly important skill to have in a reconnaissance unit. And suddenly his status went through the roof because people thought, wow, he's got something that's really valuable. And so he was elevated up. And it taught me a lesson as the commander to think, you know what, I'm leading these people. I have to be very careful not to fall into the trap of thinking, oh, well, that's Trooper Gannett. He's not good for much. And missing out on the fact that he actually made a really strong contribution.
Yeah, and this goes to the heart of some of the practical steps that can happen, and a lot of it is in the education training space. This is a civil service audience, so I've done the civil service training in terms of diversity, inclusion, bystander training, diversity allies course. I've personally engaged and done that, and I expect my team to do that, and I hold them to account if they don't. But there's one thing sitting on the end of a online learning platform and ticking, you know, waiting until you can get the certificate and hoping that you've answered the questions correctly, to actually living it properly and feeling empowered. So I think any training that we do needs to be reinforced with education by experience when we're in our own environments, and acceptance, particularly in training, that people don't always get it right first time, but it's how you deal with it is a key. And I'll give you a small vignette. I had a soldier at Sandhurst that was coming through training, and cadet, but effectively for all intents and purposes, soldier. He got blind drunk at a company dinner night, came in front of me. We explained that swearing to people and drinking that much and not hosting properly and, you know, embarrassing themselves, and he couldn't remember anything, you know, wasn't acceptable. It was on the back of a week where we had a bit of that kind of behaviour, and he was removed from the course. So he was chucked out. And not a decision taken lightly, especially in that time. Anyway, he came back a year later. So he came back, and he did exactly the same thing in exactly the same time frame. So he did that at another company dinner night under my command, and I eyeballed him. But this time it was early on in my tenure, first time round, and I was finding my feet a bit. This time round, we tried a different approach, and I said, right, you have failed the service test because your behaviour has impacted on, or likely to impact on, our operational output, i.e. your ability to commission to the right standard. You have affected it. So what I want to do now is try and remediate, you know, put in some remedial training to be able to support that gap in your understanding. Otherwise, it's going to be a disaster. So rather than write him off and chuck him out again, we put in a visit to the medical centre, so he understood what's, you know, about his relationship with alcohol and what's appropriate and what isn't. Got him to do a presentation to the rest of his platoon on values and standards and linking it to behaviours, not in a humiliating way, but in a learning way, in a positive way. And then we kept an eye on him over the next few social functions. We didn't say don't drink, actually. We said, because he needed to understand, and, you know, otherwise you've got a false environment and they'll just cuff it, and then it will go horribly wrong when we put them into the field army. So, and it worked, and he's now a very successful platoon commander, and he's learnt rather than just felt the wrath of discipline. So when it comes to the model we have in the army for leadership, we look at what leaders are, what leaders know, how, you know, what they do, and then how they do it. And it's the how they do it, behaviours, using our leadership code as a framework, which we find quite powerful. And you can look it up online, Army Leadership Code, and you'll get a 32-page document. It's got to be nice and simple because I've got to understand it. And it's things like applying reward and discipline in terms of it's not about applying it in a binary way. You need to do it in a smarter way to get better outcomes from your people. and understand because you've understood them. So I think, practical steps about creating an inclusive culture is there's no one size fits all. Every time, for example, I'm when I'm looking at I'll just show you the sort of thing. So I have, where are we? These are my kind of day-to-day groups that I have. These are coloured bibs with numbers on it. We have to do that for assessment so that we're not biased or not anchored in any way. We just are looking at the numbers and the behaviours of those individuals. But we're very conscious that behind the number, there is a different journey to get to Westbury, a different journey out of there. People need nurturing in a different way. And we offer all of that advice as part of what we do here in Westbury. So creating an inclusive culture, I think it starts with understanding your people, and that takes work so that when something does happen, you can reward or discipline appropriately and in a way that's positively framed. So that's one practical step I would offer to start with.
And, when we spoke earlier, Lucy, you mentioned this idea of recognising and thanking people for what they're doing, the power of that. And I'm mindful that this is a private sector context, but it could apply equally in the public sector, could apply in the civil service and in the army, I know for sure as well, and in the military generally, which is, this idea of discretionary effort and what people are willing to do to go above and beyond. And so if you look at things like diversity networks, for example, and, there are those in the military, aren't there? You've got your various diversity networks active, and a number of role models who are prominent, not just within the military, but also in the wider public sphere as well. I'm always staggered that take your average CEO or the chairman or, the chair of a partnership or whatever, or the CEO, managing partner, and you've got all these diversity networks. They're putting in a lot of discretionary effort. And a common thing I hear from network leaders and network members is, look, I feel a bit frustrated and burnt out. I've put in a couple of years worth of effort into this stuff. It's passion. I get virtually no reward and recognition for it. And I think, how easy would it be to give someone a certificate every 6 months, 12 months to say thank you, for your contribution? It costs because the organizations often come back to me and say, yes, but we don't have any spare budget to pay them a bonus. And I said, I'm not sure half of them want a bonus. I don't think they want a money payout. I think they would just like some recognition. So why don't you give them a certificate? Why don't you sign it? And why doesn't the head of people or the head of, the sponsor of the network sign it? And I did that when I was in the position to do so. And it was really well received. I was amazed at the feedback I got. And I did it upwards as well as downwards. So when I was leading a network, and I led an LGBT plus network, I gave a certificate to our sponsors, the executive sponsors of our network, and they were really touched. I could tell when I hand delivered them. So even something like that, okay, no, it's not a £2,000 bonus, but the power of just recognising what someone's doing above and beyond, I'm sure, must be really powerful.
I think it's ridiculously powerful, and it can make it's a small thing, but it can make a profound difference. So why don't we do it more? And I'm not talking about.
I don't know why. It's just a mystery to me. I mean, it costs virtually nothing. It costs 5 minutes of time. Exactly.
I think sometimes there's a barrier because we put in place processes. So as soon as you come up with something like this, they said, right, okay, you need to fill in this form, and it needs to be in this format.
It's got to go through the corporate communications team, the brand team, the lawyers will probably want to look at it, the employment law team. I mean, I shouldn't say this in a public forum, but I just do it. And then I say, look, I'm going to ask for forgiveness later rather than permission.
Exactly.
But
and I think
in the civil service context, I'm often approached and told we don't have any budget. We've got a tiny budget for our network. And I said, well, you don't need a lot of budget. You could just do something like this. Get the director or the head of department or whoever it is.
Well, I'm due to leave this post in a few months' time. And so I've got everybody a little badge saying AOSB on it. It's not megabucks, but it's a little something, and it's from me personally to them. And it goes from my chief of staff to the contracted gardener that comes in once a week.
So you mentioned,
and it makes a difference. And I think, this is not me trying to say Giles is awesome at doing this, but it's an example of how a small thing can make a big difference. And so, you know, I reiterate again what I said earlier as a sort of a point to take away for all the delegates here is, what are you going to physically, tangibly do to make a difference to your organisation in, you know, in the next couple of days? Is it going to be write that citation? Is it going to be sending an email saying thank you? Or is it going to be a bunch of flowers to somebody who's just had a baby? Or is it, you know, what is it? And I didn't realise. I tend to I write. I don't like emails so much. I think they're a little bit impersonal. So I always write my thank you letters, handwrite them, and you forget how unusual that can be. I think these days, and certainly with you know, when people have a life-changing experience, it could be that I've just signed a card today for the cleaner Naomi, who comes in the morning because she's getting married this weekend. And we found out about it, and we've got her a bottle of bubbly to say well done and good luck. And it's been challenging for her over COVID. So that was a whip round and a little bit on a thing, and it will make the world of difference to her. She will appreciate it. Might not, you know, you'd say so overtly, but it will land. And you know, and there's other small instances. And it's if you look at it in terms of performance, you know, she will come into work with more of a bounce in her step. She'll be able to say, oh, hello, Lucy, or hello, Jane, or whoever it is along the corridor that we see when we meet her every morning. She's not just a cleaner. She's part of the AOSB team, delivering effect and making sure we get candidates into the field army.
I mean, I have a version of that played out in the workplace. This happened to be in the private sector, but it could just as easily apply in the public sector, civil service, wherever. Of someone who said, well, one of the things that made me really feel like I belong and that I was valued and loved was that my manager would ask me on a Friday, what have you got planned for the weekend? And I'd say, oh, well, I'm off to wherever, going to a concert, doing this, that, or the other. And then on Monday, my manager would make a point of saying, hey, how did the concert go? Or how did your trip to the beach go? And the fact that they bothered to remember really meant a lot to me, because it was like, otherwise it's just a throwaway line on a Friday afternoon. Oh, what are your plans for the weekend? Off you go. And then on Monday, it's like it never happened. But the fact that this person took the time to show an interest in someone. And she said, that made me feel really, really valued and really part of the team. Yeah. By the way, Lucy, there's some nice feedback coming from Claire Thomas. She said, really engaging session. I've loved listening to leadership synergies from a very different area. Thanks, Lucy. So even if you and I haven't specified and translated everything from military into kind of civil service, people are doing that in effect in their own minds as we talk, which is great. And I was going to pick up on that, because remember, you mentioned earlier, Lucy, about this kind of, how do you deal with people who do the wrong thing, you know, with their behavior, who don't follow your D&I training and instead misbehave. And as you've said, well, look, you know, the drastic measure is disciplinary measures that are negative, but actually, you know, the military is learning that there are ways you can manage that in a more positive way. And as you've gave that example of converting someone who is really written off as a loss to someone who's now an effective performer. So in terms of kind of what might be playing out in the public sector, often how these things show up is grievance processes. And a common piece of feedback I've dealt with is, look, either I didn't want to raise it because I didn't want to cause a fuss, or when I raised it, I felt like it had been taken out of my hands and I'd lost control over that process, and something that really could have just been dealt with at a fairly low level got escalated up into a formal process that I had no real role in, and suddenly it all was taken out of my hands. And I wonder, within the military, you know, there must be cases where grievances are raised, and sometimes they will have a diversity angle to them, won't they? Discrimination or bullying, harassment, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely flavour of the month at the moment, and rightly so. The Atherton report that came out, I was interviewed on Woman's Hour a few weeks ago. You know, that along with Baroness Goldie, there's you know, rightly it shone a light and a focus on poor behaviour in the past, poor behaviour that we currently may have, and lack of support in some areas, particularly for our veterans, and what we may need to then address into the future. I mean, I argue the case that we are changing, but there is definitely more ways to go. And I would offer that the training that we are doing, so I mean, we have to do every year MAT training, military annual training tests, MAT training. One of the MAT 2, which used to be called D&I, is now called behaviours. It's about not what you say, it's what you do, rather than, you know, so it's learning that, and you have to follow it up with the tangible objective which you're measured against annually. We thought we were doing the right thing by cut and pasting, you know, and create a diverse and inclusive environment in which we can achieve our goals and put it into our objectives and think that was enough, and it isn't. You've got to deliver against it and do something tangible. That's why I love doing things like this, because I think it helps to get the message out there that we do take this kind of thing not just seriously. It is an imperative to make sure that we are behaving well above what the society expects of us. And if people don't meet that standard, well, they need to go and find another vocation. So, and obviously that having an inclusive environment where people feel they belong, then they can become something better. So there's a really important piece there. But in terms of the complaint system, which does need a little bit more of a support and overhaul, particularly in the more serious complaints, you're absolutely right. Most of this can be done. My experience is that a lot of the low level, what is maybe tagged as low level things, it's not low level to the person that's on the receiving end, I can tell you, but what may be perceived as possibly a personality clash is simply because somebody has not understood how their behavior has landed with another person. And having somebody to mediate and explain that, or to have the humility to ask the question, say, I'm sorry if I've got that wrong, what did I do? Or the person have been brave enough, and it takes a huge amount of courage to say, I think you got it wrong. We call it calling it out. And it's important to do that, but it's blooming difficult to do if you are subordinate or if there is a sort of a hierarchy thing involved. Now, we had an individual here that found it difficult to deliver what he was delivering. And we have to read out of cards, and then the candidates do their thing, and then we go on to the next activity. And it's very simple. You've got to read exactly what's on the cards for consistency in this assessment. And that's part of the assessment framework that we use. Now, he was, for whatever reason, he was not doing this. And so therefore, we inserted some more additional training. He perceived that as being picked on. And then the other ways that, well, let's put a mentor in there to try and help or coach, you know. And then he felt, well, you're just absolutely now targeting me. My imperative is to make sure we get good outcomes for candidates, and we weren't getting them because he wasn't delivering. Now, I was on the teetering because this bit then started to become a bit personal with some of the individuals, and it was starting to get into, right, I've had enough here. And his behaviour was to react offensively and in a way that was quite aggressive. And then you try and counter that, and then everybody starts getting hectic. What it turns out is that he's quite dyslexic, so he found it difficult to read off cards. So this was always going to be a difficult task for him in this role, because it demanded that, and we didn't spot it, we didn't engage with it, and we didn't address that problem head on. So I managed to have a conversation or two, and it was about, and it was linked into, right, how happy are you? The answer, not very. And there was obviously, there was a bit of personal issues in there as well. And I said, well, I think maybe we need to do something to get you into the happy space. And it might not be here. And that's okay, because you're not doing anything wrong. It's just maybe the wrong role for you. But I know somebody who can really employ you because you are talented and it may be in this area. So we fixed it to get him into a better place. And he eventually went giving me a bottle of something very nice rather than a service complaint, because we just were able to take the emotion out of it and try and address what the core of the issue was. but it did require effort. It did require diplomacy, and I was able to be able to do it myself. But I've had another instance where I've had to potentially get a third party in because of the ranks of the people involved. So you're always going to have, because this is a people organisation, we're all in the people business, you're always going to have areas where what you think you've said isn't how it's interpreted and it doesn't land well. And I think having the humility to recognise that, apologise, go round it in a different way, and equally call it out for what it is in a pleasant and non-aggressive way, I think means that everybody can move on. But if people are unable to move on for whatever reason, I think, I've been having a conversation with somebody who basically had what seemed to be a personality clash, and when you dig into it, it was the commanding officer is clearly not fit to be a commanding officer, in my view.
A couple of more comments have come in, Lucy. So Deborah Daniel says, Colonel Giles, that's such an important point on including every member of staff in rewards and recognition. We don't do enough of it. And Anne Mwangi says, really good point, Lucy, making sure staff have a D&I objective in their annual appraisal that they can be measured against helps increase learning, changes behaviour, and ultimately the culture. And I think that the point you're talking about there is when things go wrong, when the wheels fall off, having the humility as a leader to step back and say, okay, what's my role in this? How am I contributing? Is there another way? And it's almost like a sort of, it takes us back to the very topic we're talking about, which is why an inclusive culture is a business imperative. And in the military environment, it's like, well, you've got good people there who could be contributing to your objectives. And the trick for commanders and leaders is to find out how to unlock that, how to navigate the bumps in the roads, how to overcome those barriers when people are having a wobble, and find out, well, this is because they're fundamentally unfit for this role, or is it because they need a bit of extra support? I think undiagnosed conditions must be, historically too, if you go back far enough, it must be a major contributor to people's poor performance, and what that looks like. And of course, in the civil service context, we are trying to create organizations that can provide support and belonging for people who are neurodiverse, people with dyslexia, people with a range of other visible or not visible disabilities, in addition to all the other barriers that people face, whether it's because of gender, whether it's because of ethnicity, and so on. This has been a really rich conversation, and in a moment I'm going to be asking you to share your takeaway for everyone. But if you've got some other
I was going to say that there's only so far though that you can go in, I think, in trying to support absolutely everybody in everything, because it stretches your resources, it stretches you emotionally and everything else. And when you are opening the bonnet of the car and looking and tinkering around with the engine, you've got to be careful that you don't unpick other aspects of the organisation by over focusing on in one area. That doesn't mean it's not important, and I caveat it. But also, if you have to replace it, you have to replace it.
And quite, there's a
you can do it in a way that's positive.
Yeah,
like I've done it with 3 people actually.
There is a balance there, obviously, as you say, because if the organisation accommodates itself to every single nuanced person, individual, and so on, it can dissipate its ability to even achieve its mission. On the other hand, though, we've heard for years and years, haven't we? Oh, you can't do that. Oh, women can't do this. Women can't do that. A person with a disability can't do this or that. Now, some jobs, you have to have a certain level of fitness or a certain ability to do things, and that's an inherent requirement of the job. But it should only apply when it is an inherent requirement, shouldn't it? If it's not relevant to the performance of the job, and yet we're requiring people to have it, then that's not right. And that's the thing that we are addressing, isn't it? It's not changing the job, the nature of the job fundamentally, so it can no longer be done. So in the last minute we have left, what is because you've kind of already given a takeaway, haven't you? You've said it a couple of times now, which is, to challenge people. What are you going to do to make a difference in your organization? But is there anything else you'd want to share?
I think it's you've got to, just as it's like we've gone for a little marathon here, And in order to become a better runner, one needs to recover, and that means you need to rest your body. And so with all of this amazing protein-rich stuff that's coming at you from all the speakers, I'm sure, it's really important to allow yourself time to reflect on it. And actually, that time for reflection is work. So do put a couple of hours or an hour in your day to have a proper lunch, or to properly conjugate on some of the thinking that you've done. Otherwise, it's just noise that goes in one ear and out the other, and you haven't had time to process or digest it. So my offer is, make time and be kind to yourself in order to try and become a better person, and therefore more, add value to your organization and to the team that you're working within. And so investment in individuals to build the team, to achieve the task, does start, some of that is, you've got to lead yourself within that model and develop yourself. And this is part of the process. So do that. And then also on the bit of paper you scrunched up from what David got you to get rid of at the beginning of this, you could pick the paper up again if you want, and then unravel it and write on it something tangible that you're going to do to make a difference. That would be what I'd offer. Thank you.
Colonel Lucy Giles, thank you so much. Been a pleasure and a privilege to be in conversation with you today. I'm going to allow the team to have a moment so that you can go off stage, and then we'll introduce, because we're going straight into our final session now, which is how to remove barriers to equality to build a fair and equal society.
Brilliant. Bye.